So as I said before, that's our office. That's where I'm sat now. We've got an office on the High Street in Darlington in the UK, which is a very high-yielding buy-to-let strategy area. There's our compliance stuff, but that's not what we're here to talk about today. What I would like to talk about today is the rental market, how the Renters' Rights Bill is going to affect us as landlords, um, assess the positives and negatives of that bill, because it's not all bad, and also give some advice on what you can do to prepare so that you're not kind of negatively affected by the bill. You're trying to look for the positives and possibly find a way to end up better off because of the bill, which sounds quite counterintuitive because it is quite a anti-landlord bill. So just a bit about the general market in the northeast and England in general. Rental prices have nationally increased around about 30% in recent years. This is a year-on-year increase, not every year, but overall 30% increase in recent years. And recently, the inflation in rents has slightly slowed. So, it's good for landlords that rents increase because we get more income. But it's actually coincided with the issue of interest rates going up. So ultimately, it's balanced out really, and there's been kind of no material change in sort of net profit, if you like, due to the fact that interest rates have gone up and rents have sort of gone up with them. Demand and occupancy is very high relatively recently compared to, let's say, 5 years ago. So the rental market is in a healthy position, and it's all the more reason to get involved, buy more properties, and make a return in that way. So the dreaded Renters' Rights Bill, it was actually proposed as a reform bill by the Conservatives, but it was kind of quietly scrapped, and then Labour have rejuvenated this bill, giving it a new lease of life, which basically they've made it more anti-landlord, which is not very nice for us. There's a lot of points in it, and it's a long document, but I just wanted to focus on 3 points for the purposes of today, because we've got limited time and we can focus on the 3 kind of major areas as to how it will affect us as landlords. So the first point I want to cover today is the abolition of Section 21 evictions. So Section 21 was where a landlord could just evict a tenant without any specific reason. It was just because they wanted their property back. According to this new bill, if it passes, landlords will no longer be able to evict tenants without a valid reason. Now that final part of that sentence is a key point for us landlords, because there is still going to be valid reasons for you to evict a tenant. Now, how I would invite people to think about this is, rather than just being frightened by the fact that they're saying Section 21 is being abolished, try and think about how your strategy would prefer to operate. So would you want to be able to evict tenants? And in what cases would you want to evict tenants? I would argue, as a commercial landlord where you're doing it as a business, the only reason you'd want to evict tenants is if they're not paying the rent, misusing the property, or if you wanted to sell it. Other than that, there's not many situations in which me as a landlord would want to get rid of a tenant. If they're a good paying tenant, I want them to be in the property and not leave. So these valid reasons for eviction still are present in the new bill. So you can evict a tenant for arrears, antisocial behaviour, and if you want to sell the property or move in. So overall, there is still caveats where you can evict on the grounds that you would probably have wanted to anyway. There is a few negatives. They've extended the period of arrears in order to evict to 13 weeks rather than 8. That to me is a bad thing, because it means that you've got 13 weeks worth of rent that you're chasing rather than 8. So you lose money there, essentially, if you don't get it back. There is a slight catch with that as well, which is bad for landlords. It has to be 13 weeks at the date of the court summons. The court event. So that means a tenant could pay a week's rent before the court date, and then the court date would kind of have to be postponed or cancelled, because essentially you wouldn't have the grounds to evict. I don't agree with that one. I think that it's a bit silly, and I think that it should be, as long as it's 13 weeks at the date you sort of serve the eviction, that should be, valid. You should be able to evict them on those grounds, rather than them being able to sort of reverse it, if you like. The possession order for antisocial behaviour is not a great one because it's difficult to prove antisocial behaviour. The only negative I can see in this is if a tenant is kind of damaging your property. It doesn't kind of have an explicit, definite grounds to evict on that basis, especially if it's subjective and the tenant can dispute that the damage is caused by them. That's kind of an area of concern, but at the end of the day, if they're still paying the rent and they're planning to be there long term, if there is a little bit of wear and tear, so to speak, on the property, then ultimately they're paying the rent, so in the long term you'll be getting a return and you'll just have to repair the property when they eventually move out. So in summary, for this point, I would like to ask you a question. Does this reduce the landlord's ability? It does reduce the landlord's ability to reclaim possession, but does it really impact your strategy? And I don't think it does as such, because you've still got the grounds to evict when you would want to evict in normal circumstances. Okay, so on to the next point I would like to discuss today, and this is rent controls. This one is a little bit more controversial because it does border on kind of anti-capitalist and anti-free market sentiments. My opinion, and it is just an opinion, is that kind of market forces tend to govern rates and prices. I do think sometimes there's an argument for limits if something's getting out of control, but I don't personally think that the rental market is nationally falling into that category. Some may argue London is bad, but I deal in the northeast in high yielding areas, so I don't think it's kind of applicable to me. So rent increases will be limited to once per year, and you can only increase the rent to the market rate. So again, to a tenant, the optics of that sound like the government is helping them to restrict the landlord's rent to market rate and only increase it once a year. I would argue that landlords would only charge the market rate anyway because they wouldn't get tenants if they didn't. And counterintuitively, when you say to somebody you can increase your rent once a year, how many times a year do you think they increase it? I would argue it's once a year. How many times do you think a landlord would increase the rent if they were not told that they couldn't increase it more than once a year? A lot of them would never increase it. They just forget about it. They're happy with the tenant and they never think to increase the rent unless it comes to their attention. So this could actually cause landlords to regularly increase the rent once a year where they wouldn't have normally. So I actually think it's kind of creating a problem there for tenants. And a little anecdote I like to say for this example is, in COVID in the UK, we were given a restriction. The government said, Boris Johnson at the time, that you could only exercise once a day for 1 hour outside. And everybody, even those who would never exercise, was out in the street exercising once a day for an hour. But they never did when they weren't given that restriction. So that kind of further supports my point that I think this will lead to more regular rent increases, whereas landlords would have been happy before just to keep them as they were. So the other point on this rent control section is that bidding wars are prohibited. Now I think this is probably the bit that I object to most, because if you've got a property on the market for, let's say, £600 and you've got 5 people that want to have the property, giving them the option to raise their offer is a valid market action. And the government's actually taking away a tenant's right to actually offer more to secure the house that they want, which some tenants might want to enact. So I think that's a little bit interfering a little bit, that one. But what do you think it'll do to the listing prices? Another question I'd like to postulate there. If a landlord is told that he can't attract best and final offers, they're more likely to increase the initial listing price because they know they can't go up from there, especially if it's a property with demand. So I would argue again, it sort of has a counterintuitive effect. So in summary on this point, do you think this would reduce or raise rents, and why? As I discussed, there's a chance that this could increase rents, basically, even though the optics are suggesting that it would control rents.
Paul, sorry, just one question. I mean, hasn't it been in most of the areas where there has been rent controls in different countries across the world, and in Scotland and Ireland, they've done it to certain degrees, and hasn't the outcome been pretty much that it's very people that the governments are trying to protect and keep rents down so they're affordable, end up being priced out of the market, and it's actually had the reverse effect.
Yeah, Peter, I would agree with that. And the evidence suggests from history in any price controls technique, when a government tries to do it, it's generally political, and it does seem to increase costs and prices, which is strange. It's strange that the people proposing it don't look back at history and learn that lesson, but it just is the way it is at the moment. And I think overall, is this bad for business if you're a responsible landlord? I would argue it's not, even though it sounds bad. If things follow the pattern that you just suggested and it increases the rents, then as landlord you're going to get more turnover. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, there is probably, just to balance the argument, there are probably some situations where landlords have a high demand property in London, and they really do sort of act extortionately on the market. This is
Yeah.
probably made to limit that, but I think that's an extreme case, and by putting it in a national format, I think it's probably misdirected, to be honest.
Yeah, I would agree.
So yeah, the Renters' Rights Bill, point number 3, which I want to discuss today, is a general one. There's a lot to fit in, so I've crammed a lot into this point, but the general theme here is that they're improving tenant protections. And some of this I agree with, some of it I would question again, but the general theme is that tenants will have stronger protections against discrimination. And an example is, you have to allow pets in a property now, according to this bill, if it is carried through. And you're not allowed to discriminate against, for example, tenants with pets, or tenants in receipts of benefits, or tenants with protected characteristics. Now, that all sounds reasonable anyway, I think, and some of that goes without saying that that's what landlords should be doing. I think this is just a way of trying to enforce it, if you like. But I do have my doubts about how they can enforce it, because if a landlord has 5 tenants applying for his property or her property, then they can ultimately choose which one to select. And I don't know how they can prove or get into his mind to enforce that he selects any different to the one he would want to select. So it does border on a gesture, this sort of this part of the bill. But it is also referring to advertising as well. I think the main way they'll be able to enforce it is in advertising. So you can't advertise that you don't accept tenants, tenants with benefits, or you can't advertise that you don't allow pets. But ultimately, the landlord will still, in his own mind or her own mind, be able to decide who he wants in the property. The worst case scenario is that a tenant feels that they were rejected because of one of these issues. They could probably, challenge the landlord, and he would just have to prove that the reason he chose them wasn't because of that, ultimately. But I do think that's a bit of a difficult one for them to enforce. The final bit here is that there's going to be a mandatory ombudsman and private rental sector database in the UK. Now, as a landlord, some people would think this is a bit awkward because it increases sort of transparency in a sort of bad way. Sometimes the landlords want to leave it to the letting agent and kind of want to be out the way. This obviously gives the tenants a sort of free legal redress system to challenge the landlord, and also it enforces the landlord to put all their certificates and compliance data on a public database, what tenants can look at. It depends which way you look at this. I actually think it's a good thing because it increases transparency, accountability, and ultimately, if you're a responsible, compliant landlord, then you should welcome this because it's kind of giving you a tick in the box of saying that you're doing it right. And it will also reduce competition because any rogue landlords that might be undercutting you in the rental market and not getting their certificates and not doing things properly, this will shed light on them and it will decrease competition. It could lead to more deals being available to buy when all of these people sell their properties. But also in the rental market, it could increase demand for your properties, give you a greater market share, and ultimately possibly increase rents because of lack of supply when all of the rogue landlords sort of quit and sell up, which I've seen in our business. Obviously, we run a sales arm as well. We've had landlords come in recently to the shop and saying, I want to sell my properties. You know, I'm sick of all this stuff that the government's bringing out to restrict landlords. I want to sell. Now, when we've went to sell their property, we found out that they don't have the necessary certificates to rent it. And we weren't renting it, we weren't involved, but they were renting it themselves without being compliant. So their response to the government increasing accountability was to sell. So that means that my properties in the street will have less competition. So again, if I'm speaking to responsible, compliant landlords, this is not necessarily a bad thing. And in some ways, it's like getting free consultancy because most people in business would pay thousands for a consultant to review their business, see what they need to do to be compliant, and give them advice and a checklist on it. The government here is almost providing you free consultancy to give you assistance in being aware of what you need to do to be compliant and to give you a kick up the backside to do it. So I don't think it's a bad thing. It increases standards as well, generally, so it's good for the market. In summary, this could be a good thing to build trust, accountability, and improve standards, which ultimately, you know, I'm happy with. So, just to give a summary on this, the Renters' Rights Bill is getting bad press. I don't like the sentiment that is put out about it by the government, as in what Peter referred to earlier, as in like anti-landlord. But ultimately, again, as is normally the case with these type of measures, it's possible that it could actually be in favour of a landlord, even though that's not what's intended. So let's look at some negatives here to finish off. And then I'm going to counterbalance them with some positives, which is kind of just a different way to look at the same point. So one of the negatives is for this is there's more barriers to entry for a landlord. They're increasing the sort of things you have to do to be a landlord, increasing the negative aspects in terms of, you know, tenants being able to hold you accountable if you class that as negative. So there's more barriers to entry. So that will have the effect of probably reducing competition, as I've mentioned, because less people will bother to be a landlord. So you'll have a higher market share, possibly. It's also increasing the consequences of you know, not being compliant or not doing things right. Again, if we intend to do it right, that shouldn't be a problem. And ultimately, if you do it right, you're getting greater trust from your tenants. It's improving the tenant-landlord relationship, possibly. If a tenant can log onto a database and see that their landlord is responsible, compliant, and one of the good ones, it could lead to greater retention, more loyalty, and a better sort of outlook on the landlord from the tenant. So that could be positive. With these restrictions and the abolition of Section 21, there could be less flexibility for a landlord in theory. So less options regarding evictions and less options, again, in theory, regarding sort of increasing rents and stuff like that. Again, that could lead to higher tenant retention because ultimately, you know, if your tenant feels that they're secure in their property and they can't be kicked out, they might feel like staying there longer. I know for myself, when I think about renting a house with my family, I actually don't like the idea, because we could live in there, we could set up home, I could decorate my daughter's bedroom, and the landlord could come in and say, I want my house back, get out. And that gives me an anxiety about renting a house. If I knew that there was restrictions on that landlord kicking me out, I would make that house feel more like home. So possibly that could lead to higher retention from tenants. So in a way, by making the rental market more professional, the government is giving the landlords a bigger market, because tenants are going to trust renting. So they might rent more, in theory. Anyway, next point, one of the negatives is restriction on rent that's chargeable. And again, a positive that could come from that is that rents could end up going up. It's not guaranteed, and I know I'm being a little bit positive about all of these negatives, but it could actually be the case. It's probably more likely that happens than the other way around. Finally, the final negative I see, for today, is there's more administrative tasks. So yes, we don't like looking at these papers, because we say, I'm going to have to do that, I'm going to have to do that, I'm going to have to do that. Obviously, you can use a letting agent who can help with that and take a lot of the burden, and I would advise that. But ultimately, the more administrative tasks it creates improves compliance practices for you. So it can, again, help you to improve your practices to be a better landlord, and basically, be more professional, which could get you a better return on your investments in the future. And one of the examples we've had recently with our HMOs is that we've built a relationship with a fire service that tests our smoke alarms and emergency lighting systems, and they have a diary that they use to remind us when it's due. So that's a way you can improve practices, and sometimes the increased necessity for compliance makes you do that rather than put it on the back burner. So I hope you've enjoyed the talk today. It's been a pleasure to take part. I've worked with people from South Africa before. There's one person that I work with that we found them houses when they lived in the UK. We refurbished them and then we rented them out for a while. And then they decided they missed the weather and they wanted to go back to South Africa. And what we actually did at the end of the whole relationship was we offered to buy their houses back off them, add a profit to them, so that they could move back to South Africa conveniently without worrying about a complicated sales process. And we have them properties in our portfolio now, and that was a great experience. And I'm sure they're enjoying the better weather now. So to finish with, how can you prepare for this? How can you prepare for this bill? And my answer would be, just continue with what you're doing and be a responsible, compliant landlord, and this could actually be good for you. It will be bad for the rogue landlord, which is probably what it's intended to be bad for, but I don't think I'm talking to people. If you're involved with Wealth Trek and you're seeking education and a community like this, it's likely that you fall into the category of a responsible, compliant landlord who wants to run a professional business. So I think it's not all bad. And here's a couple of key points to be more specific on what you can do. You can ensure your properties are safe, and I know that's a general point, but there's a lot goes into that. You can respond to tenant issues promptly. So if a tenant raises something, take them at the word, assume that there is a problem, and have the will to try and resolve it. You can get a good system in place for compliance so that you have reminders, and you have a letting agent that's got reminders as well. Again, you can use a good letting agent, but one thing I would say about that is don't abdicate your responsibility to a letting agent, because ultimately they're another layer of systems and insurance for you to get things right. But if you take responsibility and you put reminders in your diary and the letting agent does it as well, there's much less likely that anything's going to go wrong. Whereas if you kind of abdicate the responsibility to a letting agent and say, well, I'm paying them so they should do everything, it's your property at the end of the day, and you're sort of slightly leaving yourself open to relying on somebody else to make sure you get everything right. So a simple system like reminders for your compliance checks for yourself to check your letting agent is doing it is a good practice. And the last point today, I would argue to foster a positive mindset towards the tenants, because if you see them as somebody who sort of causes problems by moaning about something or something like that, it's probably not going to give you the best practices in order to do these things. So, having as positive a mindset you can towards your tenants, treat them as clients, try and give them good customer service, and try and resolve the problems they raise will probably lead you to have a better performance in regards to compliance and safety issues. So that's something I would add to that. So yeah, pleasure again to take part today. We're Hannafin Estates. I'm Paul Hannafin. It'd be a pleasure to speak to some of you in the future, and I hope you're enjoying your education so far and your property investing journey. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Paul. Really insightful and very balanced presentation, which I think that doesn't happen often. It's sort of scaremongering one way or the other, and I think you've given all of our students a lot to think about. So really do appreciate it, and I just from my side, I do think, also just highlighting the importance of a good letting agent, in that, obviously it is going to be harder to remove tenants. You obviously got to follow a process and it will take a little bit longer. But I think what is important is trying to get the right people into your properties from the get-go and not rushing at that first applicant that comes in where you're not 100% sure. I think probably what needs to happen is just a little bit more time is taken to make sure that you get the right tenant into your properties in the first place, and I think that would alleviate huge amounts of problems going forward.
100%.
Yeah, awesome. Great. So thank you so much, Paul. It really has been insightful. Guys, as I did say a little bit earlier on, there is a more detailed presentation from Paul and Hannafin outlining the sourcing business and some of the other services that they do offer. It's on the portal, so Deirdre just put it into the chat box there. So go and listen to that, and if you're looking to source properties in the Northeast, then certainly Paul is the person that you should be contacting. So thanks so much, Paul. I really appreciate your time this evening, and we look forward to chatting with you in the future.